Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever you're joining us from. Thanks for tuning in. This is our first webinar proper in the WorldFAIR webinar series presenting project outputs. Today, we're talking about social surveys and cultural heritage. A few very quick housekeeping notes before we begin. So we are recording this webinar. The recording is going to be uploaded on the WorldFAIR website and our YouTube channel. You can post your questions in the chat during the presentations. There will be a Q&A section following after each presentation. So post them in the chat and we will get to them after our speakers conclude their talks. So, like I said, first webinar proper from our case studies today. Here where the very helpful big arrow is pointing, this is where we are today. And we have two more webinars coming up in June. One like a bonus webinar outside this webinar series from our work package 10, the agricultural biodiversity, and one more webinar from our project coordinator, work package 2, on the FAIR implementation profiles, experience in WorldFAIR, and the cross-domain interoperability framework. Loads and loads of webinars coming, more dates are being added. You can find everything on our website. The link is there at the top right. Now, our agenda for today. First, we will hear from Steve McEachern, who is the director of the Australian Data Archive and co-data officer. He will speak about the findings of the WorldFAIR Work Package 6 case study on FAIR implementation for cross-national social sciences survey data, which is the deliverable 6.1. Steve will discuss opportunities for international alignment, harmonization, and implementation of FAIR for data from social surveys in Europe and Australia. And he will talk to us about findings of the FAIR implementation profile exercises and the recommendations made from the this case study for the European Social Survey and Australian Social Survey data. And the Q&A will follow. Next up, we will hear from Beth Kazook, who's the project manager for research data at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Beth will speak about the Cultural Heritage Mapping Report, which is deliverable 13.1 in WorldFAIR. And Beth will discuss findings and recommendations for cultural heritage image sharing platforms around the world, addressing the key questions in their work so far, which is the common threads in GLAM practice, process of selecting, digitizing, describing, sharing, and preserving an image, and how the DRI aligns with these best practices. And a Q&A will follow after Beth's presentation as well. So I will now stop sharing my screen and I will pass the floor on to Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
So I'll just bring up my screen sharing at the moment. And bring up our, there we are. Okay. So thanks everyone. So it's great to have the opportunity to speak about the work we're doing in the social surveys work package in the WorldFAIR project itself. I'm Steve McEachern from the Australian Data Archive. I'm presenting on behalf of colleagues at ADA and at SIGT, which is the Norwegian, formerly the NSD, the Norwegian Social Science Data Archive, now part of the larger consortium in Norway. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement to say acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, seas and waters, the areas that I live and work and meet on, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in Australia. And I acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. I'm also going to start with a brief apology. I'm up presenting first because my daughter is her very first violin concert recital this evening, so I'm going to be making an exit halfway through the webinar. It wasn't unintended when we planned the session itself, but we're going to be nice and tight to deadlines, because I'm very excited. 9-year-old join us as well. So a little bit about the partners in the project, because it really sets the background for what this work package was trying to do. So I'm based at the Australian National University, the Australian Data Archive. The ADA provides a national service for collection and preservation of digital research data, and it's one of many social science data archives, which are fairly common institution in the social sciences domain, and particularly the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives is one of the large ERIC programs in Europe. we're based at a centre called the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods at ANU, which is a strong tradition in survey data collection, social science research methods, and then data collection activities. SICT is the Norwegian Agency for Shared Services in Education and Research, formerly known as NSD, and it's based in Bergen in Norway. SICT develops, acquires, and delivers services for education and research in collaboration with their users, offering a common infrastructure for education and research across Norway to provide capacity for customers and support digitization, data sharing, and open research. The opportunity here, what we were interested in doing in this particular work package was, WorldFAIR is really looking to address particularly broadly the goals of FAIR, but particularly the interoperability of services. There's a strong tradition of comparative social research, particularly comparative social surveys in the social sciences. We work together a lot on running international programs and surveys. So between ADA and the ANU and SICT in Norway, we're both involved in collaborative international social survey projects, which includes the European Social Survey, another survey, the International Social Survey Program, election studies. Quite a lot of these programs are actually oriented around these communities. We both provide data archiving services, so we're responsible for data management and processing and dissemination of data and coordination with data collectors. We both run survey research projects, and usefully, we're also jointly members of the DDI Alliance, which is the major metadata standard used in our domain as well. So what we wanted to look at was the opportunities for both manual and automated data integration and shared data processing between the two agencies. Look at how we can bring some of that together. And the opportunity, arose to do a case study around a parallel project we'd actually done with the European Social Survey in Australia, which we called the Australian Social Survey International European Social Survey. It was actually a replication of parts of waves 9 and 10 of the European Social Survey. So we had data sources, we had common data sources, common infrastructure, common practices that we wanted to be able to compare and contrast. So the work package itself, what we're trying to do is a comparative study of data management, harmonization. How do we look at aligning these data and integrating the data between two countries, or actually between a satellite country and a main, the core European Social Survey. What are going to be the infrastructure, administrative procedures, data and metadata management, and technical environments, and do a comparative study there. Look at the current state of play, which is really the focus of today, what we can do in terms of establishing best practices for improved harmonization and shared process management, and then progressively the implementation. It's looking to leverage the DDI metadata standards. In other parts of Alex mentioned is sort of another part of the series. I'll be looking at the cross-domain interoperability framework, and DDI has been working quite heavily on a cross-domain interoperability extension to our current standards framework, to understand how multinational collections could be made interoperable and reusable through shared procedural and technical development, and then to establish a set of guidelines for development of cross-national collections into the future using ESS as a base, but progressively into some of the other comparative programs that we're involved in. So the emphasis today, we have three broad deliverables, but I'm going to focus on particularly the first deliverable, the cross-national social sciences survey FAIR implementation case studies, and I think we've got a link to the first output of that as part of the registration process, and we can disseminate that. That's available through the Zenodo, the WorldFAIR Zenodo site. There are two other deliverables, and we'll be talking about the second of those at the end of this year, looking once based upon the outputs of that the case studies, looking at tools for assessing, comparing the FAIR status of the machine actionable content we hold in the social sciences, to provide guidance and a checklist for making social science data fair or fairer. Actually has a fairly strong track record of fair data support in the social sciences, but looking particularly at discipline appropriate means of assessing fairness of social science survey data. And then we're going to, as the last part of the work program, we're going to be piloting the implementation of those guidelines with the next round of both the ESS and the Australian version satellite study as well. So to do this work, we say the foundation of this was actually the use of the FAIR implementation profiles that's come out of the FAIR community and the related FAIR enabling resources. So we're using the FAIR implementation profiles as a basis for making the assessment of the sort of practices and resources that we had available to us, where they were, what was available, and doing a comparative fit between the two implementations in Australia and Norway. The FIP itself is managed through a FIP wizard. There's an online tool. We actually use a spreadsheet version of this rather than and put some of it into the online tool. We haven't published the online version, but you can actually find it as an appendix of the report. The outputs of that that FIP, the implementation profile. So in the process itself, the FAIR implementation profile was a pretty useful tool for actually making the sort of assessment about where we do have shared resources and practices. So in using the profiling tool, we were able to actually identify a lot of the core resources and shared infrastructure that we're actually able to rely upon across the domain. So what we were finding in the process itself, we have similarities and differences in our practices, but there's a strong tradition of sharing of practices that goes back about 50 years in the social sciences and the archiving community. We tend to use common standards, technologies, and resources. So let's just share data dictionaries and data models. But the differences tend to emerge, and I'm going to extend upon this as we go through the presentation, in the version of software and standards and the version of the approach that we're doing. Different, SICT is more progressed in terms of its capability and its infrastructure at this point in time. So ADA was having to think about, well, how do we catch up to where they're at? But we can harmonize these, and that's really going to be the emphasis of the program. The FIPs themselves were actually very helpful for looking at to be able to describe the practices themselves. And so what it does is actually allows you to profile, well, what are the resources that we use, and where are the standards that we're leveraging and the technology that we're leveraging to align with each of the FAIR principles, really working through each of those and the sub principles as we go through. And we have been able to identify quite a lot of common resources, which aligns well with the FAIR enabling resources framework that has been developed in the FAIR community. And we'll be looking to actually build these out between us as part of our second and third deliverables. What have we discovered in the process itself? We have very good practices about enabling consistent resources. We're able to point to key resources that we do use across the domain. But we have very specific needs and requirements in the social sciences. I'm going to dig into those in a little bit in a moment. But there are some domain agnostic requirements. We make heavy use of classifications of vocabularies. We like standardization. We use datums, we use harmonizations. All of these are potential FAIR enabling resources that could be made accessible and actually could be specified through registry services, which I'll come back to. In the process itself, we did discover a little bit about the FIPS methodology and the tools themselves, which we can extend upon. We put that feedback back into the discussion of where the FIPS and FAIR's approach might be helpful. We need to be very specific in the social science about what we can reference in FAIR enabling resources. And I'll give you a couple of examples as we go through. At this point in time, it's not clear that the enabling resources can currently cope with the degree of specificity that's really required. We were trying to specify some of those quite particularly, and it was probably more specific than the infrastructure was and the standard was really able to cope with at this point in time. But that is something we would like to contribute to into the future. What sort of resources do we need that we're really interested in know? So to touch upon those, Let's say our workhorse technology is a social survey. So we have a questionnaire that basically has, here's a question, here's a set of possible answers, and we're able to define the content of those in very, very specific ways. So we have a variable that might, as a column in a tabular data set. We have a question that we can, that appears in a survey, and we have some instructions that go along with that. We have a set of response domains, categories, and codes, which lend themselves very well to vocabularies and services. And this example, let's say I've taken this, in fact, from the International Social Survey Program, but this same question appears over and over in multiple surveys, and there's 4 links to different places where this can be reused. So we do like reusability, but it tends to be fairly manual. We even have concepts sitting behind this. So what's your main employment status is really the concept we're trying to measure. So we use concepts a lot. So and there's concepts everywhere, but it's very hard to connect the dots through the current implementations we have in the social sciences. I'm just making sure. We can use our DDI standard for this, but we need more than that. And this is really where we're looking to head in the next phase of our work. What we need to be able to do to sort of scale up our interoperability in the social sciences to connect humans to machines and the machines to each other. Humans make errors in our process. Machines can pick up the differences, but they don't know what to do about them, or at least not yet. There's probably some strong opportunities for machine learning that we could be exploring here. So as a simple example here, here's a case of a comparison between 5 waves of one of the surveys that we've run, and comparing. Here's the code, the text that appears in our variable, asking about are you currently studying or not. And we have common codes, 1, 2, or 3 that are applied to those. But we end up having actually a difference in our third category which is really a spelling error. Now, a human will know, look, I can just actually treat them as the same thing. But say for machine-to-machine interoperability, that's not sufficient. We have to start thinking about how we specify rules around what to do about this. But we have to be able to identify the types of errors that have been made first, and then articulate the processes for doing something about them. All right, let's say, so this example is purely, we're just missing the commas, but we don't know how do we instruct a machine to do something about that is really something we want to progress. And our content's not accessible in machine processable form in a lot of cases. We have heavy use of PDF data dictionaries in the social sciences. Our national statistical offices might produce things in HTML, but these are great for humans, but they're not usable for machines. So from an interoperability, we can find them, we can access them, but we can't interoperate machine-to-machine services on the basis of these. So where we've come to in our work, what our case studies actually identified is there is quite a lot of harmonization, at least at a process and an administrative level, between what we do in Australia and Norway. So our source content is fairly closely aligned. Technical infrastructures are often cloud-based. We leverage a national computational infrastructure here in Australia, but we still use a cloud, cloud-oriented services. We have API-based, access, common authentication mechanisms. A lot of the FAIR assessment told us that there is quite a lot of consistency in what we do between the two organisations, and the report goes into some of that detail. But what prevents greater coordination is really the differences in the implementation I kind of touched upon. So, in terms of specifics, if we use different processing software, SICT uses Python and Jupyter. ADA has traditionally used the SPSS statistical software, but increasingly R and R Markdown. So what we have to be thinking about is, well, are there shared libraries we can use between those two systems? Different versions of standards means you limit our interoperability. We're on different phases of the standard that we use. So the codebook, we use an earlier version of the DDI codebook. The DDI lifecycle standard is the one that's more interoperable and better designed for reusability of content in our environment, and probably better links. Progressively, the next stage CDI version of the standard it tries to take that even further again. We also don't make much use of metadata registries. So we produce a lot of metadata, we make it accessible. We don't always have it registered and reusable and persisted. But the technologies are coming along in our domain to allow increasingly that to occur. Particularly, we've progressively migrating, and SICT has adopted a tool called Collectica, which has a registry service, and using common technologies like GraphQL for interaction with the metadata as a way forward. So that led us to our recommendations, really aligning around, well, how do we address those sort of three shortcomings? How do we align standards? How do we establish common tools and services and practices between the two communities? And how do we establish and make better use of registries so that we can actually reuse that metadata rather than producing our own and making those human errors as we go through. So where possible, we should be able to, we design these surveys to be interoperable. We should be able to reuse a lot of the detailed metadata to allow us to, get that machine-to-machine interoperability a lot more readily, and to avoid that sort of, those spelling differences or code differences. If we can do that, we think we can facilitate much more effectively the interoperability between our two organisations, but progressively within the social science domain more broadly. And that's really what the next stage of our work is really trying to do. So we have working towards upgrading the sort of and aligning the versions of the standard that we use. We're looking at sharing processing scripts and a common API interface between the two that we can implement in the two organizations, and particularly making increasingly heavy use of the registries that we're so that we can better reuse the metadata that we're producing in the domains across the domain. That's always been a goal, but we're looking at how do we actually make that actionable, and that'll really be the emphasis of deliverable too. So that's a bit of an update on where our project's work package has got to, and happy to field questions at this point.
We have no questions in the chat as far as I can see. Would anyone like to either raise their hand or post a comment in the chat? Maybe people want to let you go to your daughter's concert. No?
I guess I'm more than happy. I think we've got the contact details certainly for WorldFAIR, and so if people would like to reach out, into the future. Certainly we're more than happy to sort of take questions and follow up with any queries people may have. Look forward to feedback on the paper itself and to seeing people going forward.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I think we can let you go.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks, Beth, for picking up from here. Look forward to seeing more on that too.
I hope it's a great concert.
Thank you. Beth, floor is yours.
All right, let's figure out which screen I'm supposed to share. There we go. You see my presentation?
Yep, great. All good.
Perfect. I'm in a slightly different setup than usual, so I'm a little bit hesitant, but all right, let's get going. Let's talk about work package 13, the cultural heritage case study, and our first deliverable, which was looking at current practices in sharing image data. So just a kind of quick overview about what I'm going to talk about. I'll tell you a little bit about the cultural heritage image sharing case study and DRI's involvement in it, the Digital Repository of Ireland. We'll go over the results from the Cultural Heritage Image Sharing Practices report that we put out in February. And then we'll talk a little bit about our work towards developing recommendations, which actually have come out in the second report now. They were just published in May, but we're doing a follow-up webinar with Steve when Steve talks about his second deliverable and further work in the social sciences, and we'll talk about our second deliverable. And at that point in time, we'll also talk about the DRI's attempts at implementing the recommendations, because right now the recommendations that are out are kind of broadly aimed at where we see there could be improvements in the GLAM image sharing practices, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And we're going to put those recommendations to work at the DRI and talk a little bit about how we see them applying to the work that we do. All right, so let's talk about the DRI first. The DRI is Ireland's national repository for the arts, social sciences, and humanities data. It's a Core Trust Seal certified repository that has from the beginning approached cultural heritage collections as data resources. And the DRI has engaged in activities over the years to promote open science. We've been engaged with the FAIR principles. We have a statement on our website about the work that we do to support the FAIR principles, or what we've aimed to do to support the FAIR principles in the past. The DRI accepts collections data both from GLAM organizations, so as I mentioned, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums from the collections side of things, cultural heritage sector, but we also accept data from researchers. And so I think what has happened over the years is that we've developed a rather bespoke approach to FAIR with the needs of both of those communities in mind. And that kind of puts us in an interesting position to be questioning the FAIR principles application to the cultural heritage sector. So although our work package does look broadly at how the sector has responded to FAIR and where the workflows adopted by GLAM organizations could be more closely aligned with FAIR practices, especially those in other disciplines in the WorldFAIR project, major focus of our work is actually, as I mentioned, implementing changes at the DRI. Basically, we're using this opportunity to improve our own repository and to potentially use the DRI as the case study itself, so others can take a look at what we thought we were doing to improve fairness for the cultural heritage sector. So improving the DRI's ability to support the interoperability and reuse of cultural heritage images as data, and providing a test case, and again, example for others to reference. So how are we going about doing this? Our first task was to identify and document existing image sharing practices. So we wanted to take a look at the landscape, the collection side, and see exactly how well the DRI was supporting existing practices and how well the DRI aligned with existing policies in that sector. So we approached our first report thinking about how the DRI is already aligned with existing practices. Our aim was not really to be critical, but to just figure out what is currently happening and why. What are the mechanisms that allow for images to be shared? What are the common practices? How do GLAM institutions structure the image file? How do they structure the metadata? How do they exchange the metadata with each other? Because of course, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums do have common image sharing platforms that take a variety of metadata and a variety of images from types of collections with very different policies and approaches to organizing the information. What does the workflow look like, and what is ultimately preserved from that workflow? So this table that I'm showing you here, I do apologize, it's quite small. It's also available in the report, and it goes on for a couple of pages where it outlines kind of some of the key reference documents that led us to these particular points in the table. You'll note from the headings that we didn't attempt to force anything into a definition of FAIR at this point. This report is not really about FAIR aligning. Our recommendations are about FAIR aligning. This is about what are the current practices and what is the workflow of acquiring an image to preserving an image and everything in between that happens at GLAM organizations. We partly felt that starting from this perspective where we were looking at GLAM workflows meant that, starting from the perspective of looking at GLAM workflows and not necessarily looking for FAIR practices to start, would mean that we would take a look at everything. If we were looking just at FAIR, we might not notice some things that were happening in the sector. So we took a very, very broad look. We use the language of the platforms, and we use the language of the professional bodies and societies and leading organizations in order to construct our documents, to create an overview of what an image sharing workflow looks like. How are digital images selected? What discovery tools are available? How are they described? What metadata is applied? What facilitates their presentation and reuse? What technical standards guide image creation and dissemination formats? And what efforts go into ensuring that digital images persist? We also took quite a good look at the technical mechanisms through which images are actually made available on a variety of national and international platforms. Again, making the point that when it comes to image sharing, the cultural heritage sector is already supporting a lot of interoperability. So we wanted to look at what facilitates that, what goes into the interoperability that allows, you know, an archive and a museum to both share on Wikimedia. What's happening there? The deliverable identified also in our report, we identified where the DRI specifically aligned or diverged from these foundational policies and approaches. We basically took a look at the DRI and said, we are also an image sharing platform, and how, like, what are the technical supports that we offer, and are they the same as what is being offered in some of these other types of platforms? So again, you take a look at the report, you'll get the actual DRI summary here. DRI summary there, but I'm going to go through the key findings of the report for you here in this presentation. So first of all, I want to highlight the easy wins, the things that we immediately identified that organizations were doing very well, that we did see as being FAIR supporting. In the first place, open file formats allow for easy reuse of image data. There is a lot of coalescence around the types of file formats that cultural heritage organizations have already decided to share. And there's a lot of digitization guidance that ensures that there's a limited number of open file formats that organizations are creating. So there's really good technical support there for the file format. Metadata standards are widely used and information is easily exchanged between systems. We didn't really have to look too closely at metadata or controlled vocabularies because those are being used, and those are actually already mapped very well to the point where a lot of image sharing platforms have all kind of organized around Dublin Core. They've all kind of picked the same metadata standard for the most part, and mapped a variety of other metadata standards into the Dublin Core standard. So it's very easy to exchange information using Dublin Core. There are widely used technologies to facilitate access. So it's actually easy to go to an image sharing platform and download an image. You're just using HTTP or HTTPS. You're using web technologies in order to access images. Which means that the general public and your average researcher can very easily find and access and download images if they are made available on these platforms. Permalinks and other registration numbers allow for consistent retrieval. So where we didn't see necessarily the use of DOIs or PIDs, we did see URIs and permalinks, and we did see a long history of access numbers, registration numbers being used to uniquely identify images. So there's good tracking through the systems, which we felt was definitely a plus. Provenance information is usually available. Where something is made available on an image sharing platform, you do know the organization that it originally came from. So you know the source of the information. Now, sometimes there isn't a lot more than that, and we'll get into that probably in my next slide. But at least there is this kind of, there's an ability to track where things came from. So if stuff goes out onto the web, if it goes into an image sharing platform, you can always kind of track down where it came from. And trust in the persistence of collections is pretty well established. You go to cultural heritage organizations, you see the image sharing platforms, you access the images, you trust for the most part that those images are going to persist, that these organizations have a mandate to preserve and hold on to their collections. So unlike with a lot of other research data sets where you kind of hope this information is going to stick around, you don't kind of have the same issue of needing to establish trust with GLAM organizations, largely because that trust is implied already. Now, there are some areas for improvement in those very same points that I just made. There's like kind of the and but. What could we be doing better? Well, metadata standards may have all kind of coalesced around Dublin Core, but Dublin Core is a very simple standard. It reduces the granularity and the complexity of relationships in a lot of the metadata standards that are used by organizations. So that reduced granularity means that it's going to be more difficult to query and analyze the data. You're going to get things, information points or metadata points that have been kind of combined into fields where they maybe once were separate fields that you could query more specifically. So we wanted to take a closer look at that. Why not PIDs? Okay, so I mentioned that there is a good history of providing registration numbers and being able to uniquely identify objects, but could we be using DOIs? Are all cultural heritage links as stable as we would like them to be? Certainly you go to organizations like the Library of Congress and you have a certain amount of confidence that those URIs are probably going to persist. But then there's lots of other smaller organizations or smaller platforms where you think, will this link still resolve to where I want it to go to in the future? The user is expected to determine whether they have the rights to use the data. This is very common across GLAM organizations. Rights statements are made. There is usually some sort of indication of whether an object is in the public domain or whether it's still under copyright, but there's often not licensing information that actually tells you what that means. It's up to the user who's coming to these platforms to determine what their appropriate use is of the materials that they are being presented with. And so that pushing that decision-making onto the user, we thought was something that is probably, and has been identified in the past as something that the cultural heritage sector is doing differently from a lot of research data originating disciplines where licenses are very important to open sharing. Provenance information might not be provided to the level that you would hope that it would be provided. As I mentioned, you can often tell where something came from. You know the organization that is holding that particular image that you're looking at. And sometimes you find information about gifts or donors or where the organization got that image from or got that original object, but not always. You don't always get that information. And a lot of times that is held by the organization, but it's considered administrative data and it just hasn't been shared. So we wanted to look at whether or not there's more that could be done to trace the history of objects that are being shared in cultural heritage. And then the last question, maybe a tricky one, is trust always warranted? So we think about cultural heritage organizations as being the stewards of cultural memory. And so therefore they have an obligation to preserve and hold on to the materials that they collect. And of course they do take that very seriously, but then they also update and change records. They may deaccession some materials. They may exchange it, return it to, or repatriate materials to another organization in another country. And sometimes those records of those transactions are not necessarily available. Just suddenly something that's been deaccessioned is no longer available in that museum. And of course, you could probably go to the museum and you could figure out what happened, but it's about pushing this information out there so that it's front and center, making this kind of making sure that the trust that we place in these organizations is warranted because they're being very transparent with us as well. So those are all things that we wanted to look at that came out of our report for our recommendations. And I will speak very briefly about the recommendations because we had an excellent working group who took all of these findings and expanded upon them. This is, again, a kind of a tiny image probably on your screen. There is a larger one in the second report that you can expand and look at in a little bit more detail, but it gives you the idea of how we kind of coalesced around our recommendations. What are the key areas where we felt change needed to happen or where we thought improvements could be made in how GLAM organizations share images so that they could be more fair. So the second deliverable looks at previous attempts as well at aligning the GLAMs with FAIR principles, because we're not the first ones. The DRI and our working group are not the first ones who's ever looked at this. There have been a few efforts to kind of say how cultural heritage could be made more fair in the past. And then we do make 5 recommendations that are reasonably generalizable to all GLAM institutional practices in order to produce better alignment with FAIR. I'd like to highlight here that the overall recommendation of the report is addressing the need to shift the thinking around what cultural heritage images are. This was a big thing that came out of our report. Images need to be approached as research objects in and of themselves. We thought that that mind shift from surrogate image, which is giving you an impression or an idea of what the real image is or the real object is, was in and of itself needed to be treated as a research product, as something that, research object, something that in and of itself warranted description and warranted attention as original material. So images need to be approached as research objects in and of themselves and not simply surrogates or kind of visual metadata. In some cases, we had difficulty differentiating between what was the data and what was the metadata, because the images themselves, again, is being presented as surrogates sometimes for physical objects, could be kind of metadata in and of themselves as opposed to the data. The recommendations address how a lack of attention to information associated with digital representations contributes to a little bit of the confusion that the sector does have around licensing and citations. Like what is the thing that you are licensing? You're not necessarily licensing the original object, you're licensing the digital image. And so what are your rights around that? If you created the digital image of an object that's in the public domain, well, then you probably do have the right to license it as openly as you want to, because you're the one that created that image. And then there's a little bit more confusion there around, well, copyrighted images, though, that have been represented online, where can the licensing rights be applied to extend those? All right, and I think I will probably stop there and open it up for some questions. And just to mention, again, this was our original report. We do have our second recommendations report out now if you want to have a look at it. Some of you probably have.
Thanks, Beth. We do have one question in the chat. So
Okay.
Karen Barner is saying, could you share some of DRI current copy of rights and metadata examples and your thoughts of the changes you will take following the report and implementation?
Ooh, could you? Okay, yeah, some of DRI's current copy of copyrights and metadata examples. Yeah. Gotcha. So the Digital Repository of Ireland has had some confusing literature over the years, confusing policy and statements on our website about the licensing of metadata versus the licensing of the objects themselves. And this is a good point to bring up, Karen, because we did talk about applying licenses both to the information that describes the object and to the object itself. Karen was in our working group, by the way, so she's on the inside of these conversations. So the DRI has always had an approach that the metadata should be open. And part of this is because the DRI is an aggregator for Europeana, and Europeana insists that the metadata that is supplied to that platform be open and basically a CC0 license. So no rights reserved. Anything that we aggregate to Europeana, we have to be like, basically, if your repository is harvestable, the metadata needs to be something that another platform can take and use. So therefore, applying a CC0 license to it is the easiest way to facilitate that happening. We have not always been clear, though, in how we communicate that to our members. So in our handbook, it's advised that the metadata is all CC0. So if you are actually depositing with the DRI, this is something that you would have encountered, our depositor handbook. But then our own website, we're not necessarily, we had a statement that basically didn't acknowledge that the repository metadata was CC0. So we're looking at changing our language around that. And then going back and making sure that it's clear to our members that that was always the intention, and probably having some interesting conversations, or, you know, slightly awkward conversations about whether or not we need to establish this going forward, and how much of it we can push back and say, well, actually, it's always been that way. Did that answer your question, Karen? So our changes are largely going to be sort of culture changes and clarifying our policy language at the DRI when it comes to sharing the metadata. It answers some of it. It's a difficult question. It's a difficult question that the working group was working through as well. Because ultimately our recommendation also says we think no rights reserve should be applied to metadata that describes cultural heritage objects. But there are going to be situations where you can't, you know, like you do as much as you can, you make it as open as possible, as closed as necessary. There are going to be situations where organizations have hired out, they've purchased metadata, and so therefore they don't actually own some of the descriptive content that they would like to share. And so applying a license to something that you don't own is a challenge. And then there's a long history too of cultural heritage organizations kind of insisting on acknowledgement in a not exactly licensing kind of way, but in language that suggests you need to acknowledge where you got this from. You need to acknowledge us as the organization that holds this particular image, without it being stated explicitly as a license. And I imagine a lot of organizations would want to express that as like a CC BY license. You can use this content, but please make sure that you acknowledge us. I think the way that things are shifting, that acknowledgement is something that will come without the pushing of a CC BY license. But oh, I think metadata is CC BY. Debs is popping up. She used to work for the DRI. Yes, we're not. It isn't necessarily Debs. This is a conversation interior to the DRI that clarifies that no, it was intended to be CC0, but it wasn't always clearly stated that it was in fact CC0. So that confusion is fair. It isn't, the metadata isn't clearly licensed. Yeah, I know. It's good for us to know too, because we had different ideas about what it is we thought we were doing, and now we've realized we need to we need to clarify our language and policies. All right. Any other questions about licensing?
Nothing so far. You can also raise your hands and speak up, or post your questions in the chat.
Yeah, it is comforting. Where can this report be read online? Oh, Alex, do you have a link?
Yes, so I'll put the link in the chat again.
Perfect, thank you. I have it on my slides, but it's not easy to copy and paste from a slide.
I'll put the link in the chat now for the first report. Cool.
Yeah, and the second report is also in the same collection in Zenodo. So if you go to the first report, you'll be able to find the second one.
So I'll put our Zenodo community in the chat as well for everybody. There we go. Okay. No more questions? Thank you.
You're welcome, Anne. Yeah. Nice
Should
to see a few familiar faces.
So if there are no more questions, we will thank all of you again for joining us. And I see that you're joining us from all over the world, so that's great. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's getting late for some of you. I will put the link to the webinar series in the chat again there. So as I said in the beginning, we do have more webinars coming up in June and throughout the rest of the year. And there will be more in 2024, which we are currently in the process of scheduling. So follow us on social media and find out all about that. So here is the link to the webinar series. And yeah, thanks again. Thanks for being here.